all of you here today. On behalf of our family, we would like to thank you for coming to celebrate the life of our dad. To some of you, he was a friend or a colleague, a neighbor, a brother-in-law, a cousin, an uncle, a grandpa, a great-grandpa, a loving husband, and to three of us here today, just dad. If you knew him well, you'd know that throughout his entire life, he was a man of conviction. He hated hypocrisy. He had no respect for people who said one thing publicly and then did another thing privately. If your actions were to contradict your words, he had no time for you. And just as he practiced in his own life, he expected everyone else's actions to speak louder than their words. He had a personal philosophy that I don't think you can put a label on. He believed in the dignity and the worth of each individual, and that you could find happiness in your life, and that you could provide value to your community without subscribing to one single set of values. He was a man of many talents. I've talked with some of you today about all the things he was interested in throughout his life. He was an avid outdoorsman when he was young, hunting and fishing. He was a radio DJ in his early years in the Air Force. If you didn't know that, that's kind of interesting. But a lover of technology throughout his life, and actually one of the first people I had ever heard of building his own computer in the early days of personal computing. He taught me how to do that as well, and here I am today making my living in IT, thanks to him. When I was a little boy growing up in Topeka, it always seemed to me like my dad was capable of anything. He could throw a football or baseball the entire length of our yard, which seemed impossible. He was the lead engineer behind two very successful Pinewood Derby races. The first one, 1979 perhaps, we took second place. The next year he made some adjustments to the design and we took first place. And during those projects, Dad taught me about things like aerodynamics and friction and rolling resistance. And he was not an engineer. He just knew this stuff, which always amazed me. At Rochester Elementary, I had an assignment one year to build a scale model of a suspension bridge. I knew nothing about that. We had the Encyclopedia Britannicas at our house, if you remember those. You know, that was about all we had, no YouTube. But somehow he knew how to build a suspension bridge, so we got some wood and some wire and all these other things, and we built this beautiful suspension bridge. I wish I still had it. I got an A on it, thanks to his engineering prowess. If you remember our house up North Topeka on Union Drive, for many years there were hundreds of acres of woods across the street, ran all the way over to Highway 75. I grew up building forts and playing down there. One year we decided to build a kite, Dad and I. So I thought I knew what a kite was. He built the biggest kite I've ever seen in my life out of longwood dowels and plastic sheeting that he had, looked like trash bags. And we flew that thing out of our driveway and out over those woods, and he kept adding spools of kite string to it, and it kept going and it looked to me like it was on the horizon, and eventually the string broke. And we both kind of sat there in disbelief, and the thing disappeared. We often wondered, where did that thing end up? Did somebody wake up one morning and in their yard was this gigantic trash bag kite? But it was never seen again. He could fix anything, I learned when I was young. When we needed a new roof on our house one time, he and I went up on the roof. Mom wasn't happy about that, but we shingled a roof together. We decided at one point to finish the basement in our house up there, and I was going to have a bedroom downstairs. So we framed in the basement, put up the drywall, did the electrical and the plumbing for a bathroom and the carpet. He knew how to do all this stuff. Before cable TV up there, we couldn't get any channels except like the local Topeka channels. We desperately wanted to get Channel 41 over in Kansas City, mostly for Sunday mornings, so I could watch Abbott and Costello. That was the ask I had. So he had a full-size telephone pole delivered to the yard. If you remember KPL back then, Kansas Power and Light. Giant telephone pole just got delivered one day by a big truck. And then we proceeded to dig a hole on the side of the house that was, 6 feet deep, and however big around it needs to be for a telephone pole. Some of the neighbors came over. To this day, I don't know how he managed this, but he winched the thing up and set it in the hole, and we put concrete in there. And a few days later, he went up that thing like a monkey and put an antenna on top. He had an old belt around his, like you see a lineman on a movie or something. And he went up to the top of that pole. We put up an antenna. And it was one of the ones you could turn the little dial in the house, and we could point it to Kansas City, or we could point it at Wichita. We got all the channels. When we wanted a privacy fence around our big yard, he wasn't a guy who would open the yellow pages and find a fencing company. We went down to Payless Cacheways, if you remember that, pre-Home Depot days, lumberyard, and he ordered countless fence posts. 2x4s, fence boards, big old buckets of nails. And for the next few months, we dug post holes. I don't know how he knew how to build a fence. He laid it all out with string and stakes and all this stuff, but we dug all these post holes. We built the fence, we put up all the boards. He engineered 2 big swinging gates that worked perfectly. And when it was done, if you stood at one end of the fence and looked down the line, it was perfect. He did it perfectly. As a matter of fact, we cut all those boards by hand. We didn't have a DeWalt saw. We didn't have a nail gun. We nailed every nail by hand. But I was up there recently, and that fence is still there. Still looks good. Matter of fact, that telephone pole's still there too. Still straight as an arrow. I don't know if I climbed it now. It's been there 45 years. A few years ago, he decided he wanted to get his ham radio license. I've talked to a few of you about that here today as well. So he started studying for the exams, and his goal was to get that completed and be able to talk to people around the world on ham radio. He always had an interest in radio even back when he was younger. In the back of my mind, I always thought I'd do the same. So that we could talk over ham radio instead of full high definition FaceTime and all the other luxuries today. We want to talk on ham radio. I never got around to doing that, and sadly he didn't get to finish his licensure. He did build an extraordinary ham radio setup, Chad, you can attest, in the basement. And I don't know how to fool around with it, but he has notes down there where he was listening to people in Singapore and everything else. So there was another interesting part of Dad's life that he never spoke of. Most of you probably know he was a proud member of the United States Air Force, served for 12 years of active duty, and then the Kansas Air National Guard, here just outside of Topeka, 190th Air Refueling Group, Kansas Coyotes, home of the KC-135 refueling planes that you would have seen on TV in Desert Storm and all those things. He was really proud of being out there. And it was in the early years of his career in the Air Force that he met and married our late mother, Stephanie, while stationed in London. And then he promptly headed off for a tour of duty in Turkey. My sisters might correct me on the timeline, but I think that was pretty close. And when Ann and Karen were little, the 4 of them lived in Japan for a while. His dad was stationed just outside of Tokyo, Tachikawa Air Force Base. Don't know why I remember that. He worked for a while in the Pentagon, and then ultimately he got his orders for Vietnam, and he was stationed for a while in Thailand. Incidentally, he was in Thailand when I was born. I didn't meet him until I was 3 months old, 4 months old, can't recall, but somewhere we still have a telegram that said it's a boy. Those were short and sweet. I think he paid by the word of the letter. But when he joined the Air Force as an enlisted man, as an airman, he did his basic training in Lakin Air Force Base in Texas. And they realized pretty quickly he had an aptitude for certain things. He was very tech savvy, a really smart guy. So they started sending him to technical schools, first to several of them that had to do with communications, ultimately to a cryptography school, which I didn't know about until I found the certificate for completion in some of his paperwork not that long ago. At the time, the Air Force had a branch called the U.S. Air Force Security Service. And if you haven't heard of that, you're probably not alone. But members of the USAFSS were the cream of the crop from enlisted Air Force personnel. Top 0.5% to be selected. And information about the work that they did was classified until 1997. That's when President Clinton, in his second term, declassified millions of documents from World War II up to the Cold War. Members of this group, they weren't even allowed to discuss their jobs with outsiders and not even with each other unless they were in a secure location. And incidentally, because of their value as targets during the Cold War, their travel was pretty closely monitored. Many of them actually, he told me, adopted cover jobs. He told me about this after it was all declassified. He kept his word. Members of this group included Morse code operators, intersect operators, one of which was Johnny Cash in the early 50s. I just found that out the other day. I thought that was neat. Linguists, direction finding equipment operators before GPS, intelligence analysts, and they were monitoring and collecting intelligence information from the Soviet Union and other countries, and then sending that information back to the States, back to the National Security Agency for further analysis. And through the 1960s and the 1970s, the USAFSS deployed their intelligence personnel to a variety of places. They were in England, they were in Turkey, they were in Japan, they were at the Pentagon, he was there too, and they were in Thailand, if those places sound familiar. It turns out he was part of this elite group and he never spoke of it. He couldn't. He had a top secret security clearance back then and he took that very seriously. And it wasn't until many years after the information was declassified that he started telling me little bits about what he had done. I was fascinated and very proud that my dad had been part of this quiet group of soldiers who worked in the background without recognition to protect the interests of this country that he loved so much. Their motto was freedom through vigilance, which I really like. So I chose to share this story about Dad because I think it's a great example of the character and the integrity that he held as so important. He set an example throughout his entire life as someone who valued service to others before self. As someone who knew the importance of doing the little things for those around you and the people you love. I watched him growing up open car doors, run downstairs to carry groceries up, help someone off a step, whether it was my mom or his mom or our little pet. And after our mother passed, my dad was fortunate enough to begin another journey of his life. And he and our beloved stepmom, Peg,